Okay, so the next 15-minute recorded Zoom is Nick Percival. Nick entered Harvard at 17 to learn about the greatest achievement in physics, namely Einstein's theory of relativity. So it kind of bounces on from the previous presentations we've had. The just observed is the main element of this discussion. So keep that in mind as you watch the Zoom. Now, specialist in space-time physics and astronomy and cosmology. He graduated with a degree in physics from Harvard, and in 2016, he'd been the director of a leading-edge science organization called the John Chappell Natural Philosophy Society. Nick was also a developer of teacherweb.com and worknotes.com. And of the former, the first 10 years, he accumulated a total of over 500,000 teachers that's used his work. So this guy's kind of interesting. He's also got a YouTube channel called Nick of Time, which I thought was a very clever play on words. So let's watch this one over the next 15 minutes. And yeah, I think it blends in well with what we're doing here today. So, Matt?
Hello, I'm Nick Percival. As a kid, my heroes were sports stars, but as I got a bit older, I switched to Albert Einstein being my primary hero. So when I entered Harvard University, I chose physics as my major, and after studying the physics basics, I focused on theoretical physics, for example, relativity and quantum mechanics. My only assumption in college was that the professors would present the most accurate knowledge of physics possible for that point in time. In this intro, I will focus on special relativity and specifically on special relativity's time dilation equation. Physics academia, including Harvard physics professors, taught and still teach that special relativity's time dilation described a physical effect, namely that time physically slows as a function of relative velocity between two observers and their clocks. That's key. Let me repeat it. They taught that special relativity described a physical effect, namely that time physically slows down as a function of relative velocity between the two observers and their clocks. However, that turns out to be invalid physics. The problem of physics academia's interpretation of special relativity's time dilation is as follows. If we have twin clocks, A and B, with relative velocity v with respect to each other, then that interpretation leads to special relativity predicting that clock A will run slower than clock B and that clock B will run slower than clock A, which is an obvious logic flaw. Instead, the empirical data shows that atomic clock rate, but not time itself, slows down as a function of absolute velocity with respect to a single specific physical entity, and not as a function of the relative velocity between two observers. Hence, the special relativity model of time slowing and special relativity itself are doubly wrong. So, having seen the logic problem of special relativity time dilation, we'll now look for a bit of physics history. Lorentz's ether theory was developed prior to Einstein's special relativity. The Lorentz clock retardation equation described how absolute velocity with respect to a single specific physical entity, namely the local ether, caused clock slowing. Then Einstein took Lorenz's ether theory equations and used them as his special relativities equations. In fact, one set of those equations is still known as the Lorentz transformations. So for special relativity schematics, Einstein took Lorenz's equations, but changed the physics meaning of velocity in those equations from being velocity with respect to one specific physical entity, namely the ether, and replaced it with velocity, meaning relative velocity between any two inertial observers. Hence, while the equations looked mathematically identical, the physical models associated with the two sets of equations were wildly different. Lorenz's clock slowing equation described an asymmetric physical effect. However, Einstein's changing the physical meaning of velocity in Lorenz's equations meant that Einstein's special relativity time dilation must be described as a just observed effect and not a real physical effect. Otherwise, an obvious contradiction occurs. However, physics academia has chosen to contend that special relativity's time dilation equation describes physical time slowing, even though that leads to an immediate contradiction. Physical time slowing based on relative velocity. So back to my experience of being taught special relativity in college. The professors first taught about relativity's interpretation of the relativity principle, namely meaning that there was no preferred frame in space-time physics. Second, they taught that at the foundation of special relativity was that all inertial frames were indistinguishable. Third, they taught that all of special relativity's equations, such as time dilation and length contraction, were a function of relative velocity between all pairs of observers. All of these points individually meant that these relative effects would necessarily be 100% symmetric between any two inertial frames and their observers. And hence, they would be describing just observed effects and not any physical effects, such as actual clock slowing. Note that my Harvard professors and my physics textbooks never mentioned that in the history of special relativity there was any criticism of special relativity, even though, since day one of special relativity's publication, there has been strong and continuing criticism of special relativity. It's just that physics academia has been aggressively suppressing such criticism. So, being quite naive, I initially thought that I was the only one who thought that special relativity was flawed. But the logic flaw in special relativity was so clear, I continued to think about it, read about it, and debate relativity professors about it, including debating the twin paradox. In fact, decades ago, I developed a website at twinparadox.net that gives all the logic for the above to show that academia's view of special relativity's time dilation is inherently flawed logic. And later, when a ton of empirical data from GPS and CERN's particle accelerator confirmed that logic, I added a new homepage to that website detailing that data. That data from GPS and CERN also confirmed that Lorenz's clock slowing equation was correct, at least for atomic clocks, and that special relativity's time dilation equation gave incorrect results, except for the special case where the observer was with respect to the single preferred physical entity, as that special case was the only case where one of the two observers would get the same results as Lorentz clock slowing equation. Eventually, I wrote a paper articulating my views on special relativity, and it was published in an underground journal, Speculations in Science, I think. Eventually, I found a study that cataloged over 3,000 physics papers published up through 2003 that had criticized special relativity along the lines that I had written about. And obviously, that total number of papers has increased a lot in the past 22 years. Unfortunately, after the 1950s debate about special relativity's twin paradox, academia began censoring all criticisms of special relativity in journals that they controlled. Many physicists, eventually including Einstein, concluded that special relativity's time dilation could not be interpreted as falsely claimed by physics academia. Basically, academia holds that when observers in different frames use special relativity, all of their different, contradictory views of what's happening physically are simultaneously correct physics. Similarly, Einstein's changing the physical meaning of velocity in the Lorentz's equations meant that Einstein's special relativity is built on the construct that each and every one of the infinite number of inertial frames are simultaneous the single preferred frame, which is obviously contradictory nonsense. Lorentz's theory was sound physics, but special relativity took a giant step backwards into abstract math that had no coherent physical model. Some might question how it can be that physics academia is wrong about special relativity, and yet we have made so many technological progress, with some of that progress being alleged to be based on special relativity. Well, Lorentz theory and special relativity have equations that look like identical math equations, but they have very different physical meanings as described above. Hence, many who think they are using special relativity are actually using Lorentz's one-way absolute velocity instead of special relativity's inherently two-way symmetric relative velocity. So they are actually using Lorentz's theory and not special relativity. Further, in the NPA and later in the CNPS, we had many speakers who have developed real-world projects, and they told us they were not using special relativity's relative velocity theory because that didn't work, but instead they were using absolute velocity theory. Indeed, the professor who runs the Stanford Linear Accelerator, SLAC, told us that they first have to unteach special relativity to the PhDs that come to work at SLAC, and then teach them about absolute asymmetric velocity effects. There are several other foundational problems with special relativity that are discussed in my other videos. Now for the empirical data. I became a friend and colleague of Ron Hatch, who had 30-plus patents on the development of the GPS system and was considered the expert on GPS data. He asserted that GPS data disproves special relativity. even though it was originally claimed that GPS was built on special and general relativity. For one thing, GPS is built on absolute simultaneity and not special relativity's relative simultaneity. And also, GPS shows that atomic clock rate depends on absolute velocity with respect to the non-rotating Earth and not on relative velocity between clocks. Also, John Field worked at CERN found that particle half-life rate depends on absolute velocity with respect to the non-rotating Earth and not on relative velocity between clocks. Finally, after working on how time should best be treated in physics as opposed to how relativity treats time, I realized, after 50 years, partly thanks to GPS, that time is a purely human construct with no direct counterpart in physical reality. Basically, time is a construct that emerges from considering the rates of many different processes that unfold totally within 3D space. Again, counter to currently accepted physics theory. I have a YouTube channel named after my physics nickname, Nick of Time. So in those videos, I will refer to myself by that nickname, even though I no longer think that time is a proper construct for foundational physics. Thank you.